Good evening, everyone. I'm going to make a start now that you've managed to find the Geology Building and the Woolnough Lecture Theatre, so thank you. My name's Paul McGinn. I'm the Director of the UWA Public Policy Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight to this public lecture in partnership with Good Together and the Next Economy. This started off with a conversation a while ago with Matt Berry, who's sitting here in the front row. Matt and I met at the Waycost conference a few months ago. We got chatting about things, and Catherine's name came up in conversation, and we said, okay, yeah, let's do something around this. And there was wider policy things going on around, how do we measure what's important and, what's valuable. And Catherine, I'd met Catherine actually last year in Canberra very briefly at the Wellbeing conference. Very, you can't remember this, but we met very briefly. God, that's good, because it was very fleeting. And so it's great to have Catherine over here in Western Australia. So let me begin, just grab a seat. Let me begin by acknowledging that we're in Wajak country, and I want to pay my respects to leaders past, present, and emerging. So the purpose of tonight's lecture is to, I suppose, paint a big policy picture overview of how we might think about doing the economy and economics different, and through maybe a political economy lens. Would that be the right way to describe it, Catherine? And we had Catherine here this morning. We had a policy roundtable where a number of kind of key advocates and policymakers around the table kind of unpack some of the issues. And tomorrow, Catherine's also taking part in a workshop with a bunch of advocates in the Good Together space and others to try to unpack this issue even more, to see what we can do and grow here in a West Australian context. And Matt and his colleagues are leading that discussion. So I'm just doing pleasantries. What I'm going to do, we've got a structure tonight. I'm going to invite Matt up in a second, and then Matt's going to invite Catherine. Catherine's going to give a talk, and we're going to adjourn to the seats, going to have a little kind of tete-a-tete, and then we're going to invite you into the conversation, basically, based on the various issues that Catherine has raised. Myself and my colleague Claire Feenan will be running the microphone, so we'll be running up and down the aisles and getting our steps up for this evening. So, and I just want to introduce Matt Berry from Good Together. Matt, it's all yours.
All right, thanks very much. My name is Matt Berry. I'm 1/3 of a little outfit called Good Together. So I'll get my colleagues Joni and Ellen to quickly stand up and give you a wave. So we're a relatively new outfit. We're calling ourselves a studio for imagining better futures and bringing them to life. So we have sort of all worked across a range of different sectors trying to make the world a better place, whether it's in social or ecological terms, and really felt like we needed sort of bigger ideas big enough to sort of meet the size of the challenges that we're facing, and B, more skin in the game for ordinary people to sort of be involved in trying to shape the futures that we're all going to be experiencing. This conversation is one of those big parts of the future that we need to shape. And I think there are these big questions around politics, culture, the economy, that can feel really intimidating for lots of us. I feel like those terms, particularly if you don't have the right job or the right degree, they can feel like a bit of a conversation that you're not qualified to be part of. And I think we feel really strongly that everyone needs to be more a part of these conversations about the kinds of futures and the kinds of economies that we're going to have. And that's a big part of why we were interested in bringing Catherine over to WA to have a chat to us. Another big part of it is that we're pretty confident that if we involve more ordinary people in conversations about our economy, none of those ordinary people that I've ever spoken to are interested in creating an economy that focuses solely on increasing profits and growth and shareholder value. We think there's a bit more to it. We think people actually want the kind of economy that a Wellbeing Economy describes. They want an economy that meets the needs of people and planet. And I think we'd really love to try and invite more people into that conversation and make you feel like you can be part of conversations about the economy and how we shape it and the kinds of decisions we make about how we meet each other's needs. Because that's all we mean by the economy. It can sound like a really scary term, but it's just the decisions we make about how we go about meeting each other's needs. Thankfully, we're not starting from scratch in WA. As we've had some conversations about today, Paul mentioned there was a bit of a round table. We had some folks come together and talk about some of the great progress that's already being made in WA. There's lots of initiatives and organisations who are already starting work on building a better economy for WA, or better economies, plural. And we know that there's a long way to go as well. And so Catherine will be sharing a little bit about some of the progress that's been made here and elsewhere around the world that we can take inspiration from. That's about enough from me, and so I'll introduce the star of the show, Catherine Trebek. Dr. Catherine Trebek is a political economist, writer and advocate for systems change. Her roles include writer-at-large and co-director at the Compassion in Financial Services Hub at the University of Edinburgh, economic change lead at the Next Economy, and strategic advisor for the Centre for Policy Development. You may know that she co-founded the Wellbeing Economy Alliance globally and the Scotland chapter, and she instigated the group of Wellbeing Economy governments. I could read much more of this bio. She's a very impressive individual. I was saying this earlier today, and she doesn't like me saying it, but genuinely a global leader in this space, and we're really privileged to have her here in WA to share a bit of her knowledge with us tonight. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you, Matt and Paul and Claire and Josie and Eganon. It's a real pleasure to be here. I think you must all be visiting. Is that me? Yeah. You must be visiting probably the best-looking university campus. Sorry, I'll fix this. That's terrible, isn't it? Okay. Hopefully that will stay still. Yeah, the best-looking university campus on the planet. I've been to a lot of universities. I thought Edinburgh was stunning. UWA absolutely pips it. But I'm also really grateful to you all for coming along to talk about the economy on a gorgeous Monday evening. I walked past, so the university refectory, the pub, there are a lot of people there who have made a different choice. So what are they doing? But I'm very, very grateful to you all for coming along. And I also want to pay respect to First Nations communities here and across Australia. And I was saying this morning, it's really hard not to do work around economic system change and not really be struck by how, if the rest of us had let ourselves learn from and be inspired by Indigenous wisdom, the world would not be in the very grave pickle that it is in. Lessons around reciprocity and care for country and sufficiency, I think, are the sort of principles a better economic system deeply needs. And also recognising that what we talk about as the economy in Australia, all this apparent wealth in GDP terms, so much of that stands on unpaid rent, stolen land, and I think that's one of those not spoken enough undercurrents of the economic conversation in Australia. So I want to just ask you to do something I don't normally ask for audiences to do, but take out your phones and have a look at what your screensaver or your background lock screen is, and put up your hand if it's a picture of a son or a daughter or a grandchild. Yeah. Put up your hand if it's a picture of your dog. Yeah, a few others. Put up your hand if it's a picture of a sunset or a beach or a beautiful mountain. I've got mountains. And the rest of you are better academics who say, I couldn't work out how to change a picture, so it's like the last screen that came with the box. But I mean, it's a bit of a simple exercise, but the majority of you have on your phones people that are close to you, your pets, and a beautiful part of nature. And that, you know, with all the diversity in this room, and you could ask people who were at the pub in the refectory something similar, they all seem to have something similar. And the point is, and I'm going to come back to this later in the talk, that us human beings, despite all our diversity, when it comes back to the real basics, are remarkably similar. And there is profound hope in that if we could just get our economy aligned with delivering those basic fundamental human needs. So I'm going to tell you a bit about my story. If I can get this working. Maybe it's not on. Okay, I'm going to have to stand here. About 25 years ago, I spent a bit of time working in this tiny village in the north of Cameroon. Probably had a bit of white saviour complex. I don't think I was particularly useful, but I made some beautiful, beautiful friends and learnt a lot. And I shifted from thinking I was going to go into a work life of trade negotiations. I had a very cool lecturer at the University of Melbourne at the time. And I spent time there and thinking, oh, it's community development, that's what I want to do. And then I got back to Melbourne, and that village where I'd been living for some time was decimated by a flood. And my reaction was to get back, go and help, go and try to be useful, try to support my friends, people I'd hung out with for several months and got to know very well. And luckily, that's really not working, luckily I happened to be taking a course with this amazing woman who was probably only a few years older than me at the time, still only a few years older than me. And she was a lecturer in human rights. She's from East Timor. Her husband was in jail at the time as an activist in East Timor. And I said to her, I've just got to get back to this village of Meskin in Cameroon. And she said, don't be so stupid. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, you are this young white girl, you will just get in the way. And I said, well, but I just want to go and peel potatoes or fill sandbags or something. And she said, make the most of the privilege you have. Make the most of getting this education you have to work on why that village and villages like it were vulnerable. And so I took that to heart, and that was a key moment in raising my gaze to some of the systemic causes of challenges facing the world. And I kept going and kept asking big questions. I found myself doing a PhD with Rio Tinto, spending some time in the beautiful Pilbara region, doing almost an ethnography of a mining company, which we can talk about later. And then for no career reason at all, I moved to Scotland. Actually, that's more realistic. Scotland was an incredible wake-up call because I was living in Glasgow. Has anyone been to Glasgow? Oh yeah, it's a beautiful town. And it used to be the second biggest city of the British Empire. And now when you get off the plane in Glasgow airport, there's this massive sign that says, welcome to Scotland's biggest shopping destination. And that economic transformation and their inability to take care of people throughout that journey from an industrial town to a post-industrial consumerist society has caused huge challenges for the people of Glasgow. I'm going to go back. This is analysis done by friends of mine then working at Public Health Scotland, and they basically mapped life expectancy across various train stations as you travel from the west end of the city, where the university is, where I used to live, to the east end. And life expectancy for men falls by 2 years for every train station that you travel eastwards, to the point that, and this is not a huge distance, I was living in Hindland, out here just to Bridgeton in the East End. That's not a huge distance, Glasgow's small. And it's a gap of 14 years in life expectancy for men. And that prompted me to start asking questions about what is it about the nature of the economic system in Glasgow, how progress is measured, who is winning and who is losing out of this economic system that in GDP terms at the time, this is before the global financial crisis or the recession as the UK had, in GDP terms, the UK was one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And yet here it was people, and if the further east you went, life expectancy went down to 54. People were dying way before their pensionable age. And so channeling what that lecturer of mine from East Timor, Jackie Ciapano, said to me, look upstream, look at those root causes of why that village in Cameroon and why people in just the east end of a wealthy city like Glasgow are dying before their pensionable age. And you find yourself facing the economic system. Now, it's been all over the news today that yet again, Western Australia is one of the wealthiest in GDP terms city or state in Australia. I'm sure you're all very happy about that. I'm sure you're going to bed sleeping a lot easier because the state's value added is at yet again record levels. But part of the task of this conversation is to look under the bonnet of those headline statistics, of those statistics that are so often measured in per capita terms, which means the tyranny of averages cancels out extreme wealth at the top and ignores inequality and poverty at the bottom. And so when we look under the bonnet of those statistics in Western Australia, and huge thanks to the wonderful organisation No Place for Poverty, I don't know if anyone from that team is here, who are pulling together this sort of analysis, and also the Salvation Army's social justice stocktake. You probably all know these. 1 in 8 West Australians living in poverty. Of course, very familiar story of a disproportionate impact on our First Nations communities, single parents, people with disabilities, and those from non-English speaking backgrounds. And what they identify is that this is partly because of economic insecurity linked to precarious work, the rising cost of living, and the fraying of our social safety net. Also, the work from the social justice stocktake talks about almost 10,000 people who are homeless in Western Australia, that your drug-induced deaths are a higher rate than the national average. So things are not all well when you look under the bonnet of those averages. But the good news is that people want action. So it is time to start having those conversations, looking upstream, raising our gaze to the root causes of some of these challenges that we see when we take the time to look under the bonnet. And one of the conversations that we need to have in Australia is one of the shifts that we've seen from relatively decent pre-distribution up till the 70s, when, because Australia has a proud history of having a decent minimum wage, dates back to the Harvester Judgment. And yes, it was the big caveat of it was white, able male men, but working worked. It enabled white, able men to take care of their families. But now we've moved from pre-distribution to precariousness and an assetized economy. We might pride ourselves in Australia that we don't have an aristocracy, but we certainly do have an assetocracy, where it is your ownership of assets, particularly if you've inherited them or acquired them through other means, that determines your life chances. Working is no longer enough. And we have a profound misalignment with how we judge the success of our country, our states, our cities, our companies, and the lived reality of so many communities around the world. The dominant economic conversation focuses on gross domestic product, or maybe a little bit more sophisticated, they think, talking about productivity, which is just the same, just with a different denominator in the equation. And yet so many people across Australia are struggling to survive. We see more and more people sleeping under bridges in our capital cities, young people scared for their future, rising levels of loneliness, distress, mental anxiety. And if that's not enough, I am terrified about the levels of climate change and what's coming again and again and again in the future. And if you haven't read the National Climate Risk Assessment that says that by 2050, 1.5 million households will be facing rising sea levels, you need to take very seriously the warning of Antonio Guterres that we are now in code red for humanity. But of course, it is not just climate change. We are seeing other pressures on our planet, biodiversity loss just being one of them. So things are not all well on the environmental front. We are facing a hotter and a greyer future. And we are seeing that the economy is profoundly not working for enough people. Don't worry about the detail of this. This is analysis that was done by a group of actuaries 2 years ago that looks across a whole wide range of social issues, health and access to education, your housing, access to the environment, on all counts. If you're on a lower income, life is tougher. And this speaks to the conversation that many of you in the room will be familiar about, the social determinants of health. This is just the most recent work from the World Health Organization. They have been calling this out for decades, that your health, your physical and mental health, is not a function of the healthcare system. It's a function of wider social structures and your inequalities, your access to the basics of life. In Australia, this has been well documented for decades. This is just the latest piece, the National Suicide Prevention Plan, that clearly lists the social and economic determinants of something like suicide. And yet, in the face of that body of evidence and reality, we so often see the onus of responsibility placed on individuals to change. The locus of action is positioned on the shoulders of individuals who are told they are responsible for changing their behaviour, changing their mindsets in the face of much bigger structural issues. Now, do any of you follow the Batuta Advocate? I love them. I love them. This, to me, just speaks so much to it. Now, I thought this was quite funny and a little bit close to the bone. And I thought, you know, they make up stuff, don't they? But then just a couple of months ago, the University of Technology in Sydney was making a ton of their staff redundant. And guess what the message they sent out to their staff was? Do that task you've been dreading, like cleaning your underpants or cleaning the bathroom. Put on a song and clean the room. Brush and floss your teeth every day. Start a tea ritual and write a nice review for your favourite restaurant. Like, all of those quite nice. But if someone's being made redundant, they need a new form of their livelihood, not to be told that a tea ritual is going to take care of them. Not to be told to change their thinking and their mindset and be positive. And so against all these dynamics and these structural inequalities and the way the economy is not working for enough people, there are huge fiscal price tags. And this is kind of what I'm getting at. We talked this morning in our roundtable about avoidable costs and failure demand. This is essentially it. This was two billboards against each other in a street of Glasgow, and it just struck me as profoundly insane. And sorry if there's anyone who's into CrossFit here, but you are basically massacring your body, and then you have to pay for a remedial massage afterwards to deal with the damage that you've done to your muscles and your legs and so on. Well, so it is. So much government money is being spent downstream after the fact, patching up, healing and repairing the damage of the economic system. So much social policy is required because of so much economic policy. And my colleagues at the Centre for Policy Development have started to tally that up. They've started to look at what are the avoidable costs due to what we're calling increasingly social policy failure demand. If you're an ecological economist, you'll be very familiar with the term defensive expenditure. And so very conservatively, they said, well, if we look at the impact of child poverty, we're looking at government budget line items, so not the human cost, which is much more important, just the fiscal cost of various spending because of child poverty of 16 billion a year. And preventable diseases, they're looking in the realm of 18 to 29 billion because of so many downstream services treating after the fact. A dear friend of mine has been appointed in Melbourne as co-heat officer, basically to take care and find respite for vulnerable people during waves of extreme heat in Melbourne. Now, I'm really glad she's doing that. That's critically important in the short term, but it's an incredible sign of our failure to enable people to live good lives, be protected from the heat, and not even be vulnerable in the first place. As my lecturer from university days said to me, we need to look upstream and act on why they were vulnerable. The good news is that across Australia, and particularly in regions where my colleagues at the Next Economy work, communities are starting to ask these questions. They're starting to look upstream. They're starting to say, what does good development look like? Is the economic system that we've created that's impacting us, that's constraining or enabling our life chances the best we can have. Communities are starting to say we could do things better. And I pulled together some of the research that my colleagues have done when they're having these deep, deep deliberative conversations in places like Mount Isa or the Latrobe Valley in Victoria or Hay in the agricultural basin of New South Wales. And people, and this comes back to your phones, people in these very diverse locations say remarkably similar things. They want decent local jobs, sense of purpose. They want to be able to enjoy their local environment and see it protected and taken care of. They want to have a sense of agency in decision making. They want First Nations leadership to be respected. And essentially, this really resonates with what my colleagues at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance have pulled together, where they crowdsource from a whole wide range of different agencies the very most basic needs that our economy needs to deliver. Things like dignity, fairness, participation, purpose, and all respecting the boundaries and celebrating the sanctity of nature. And Mark and I have been talking about this, at how strange it is that this is what so many of us collectively want. And whether you are a sociologist or you study neuroscience or you just have conversations with your colleagues or you look at what most people have on their screensaver, what most people really want, what's important to them, is very different from the outcomes of our current economic system. And there's an American scholar, Francis Moore Lappy, who says, why is it that we are collectively creating a world that none of us as individuals actually want? And so that's why it's time for new recipes. And you're probably all too old to remember this book. My mum certainly loved it. I've had my fair share of those dolls with icing and cake and those frogs and so on. But we're in a different era now. The recipes of last century are no longer fit for purpose. And yet the dominant economic discussion acts like we are still in the 1980s. The same prescriptions, just press harder on that pedal, on that push down more, on those same old recipes that are not working for enough of us. So it is time to say, can we imagine an economic system that serves us rather than the other way around? Can we start to explore different ways of doing things that are more fit for our time? And I love cooking, so let's go with someone much more sophisticated, the Woman's Weekly. Let's go with Jutta Motolinki. So essentially, the very basis of a wellbeing economy is to move from seeing the economy as something of which we are all in service to and treat it as an input to, and see a wellbeing economy as positioning the economic system, as Matt said, as a provisioning system that is there, designed, delivered, measured accordingly to serve us, to meet the needs of people and planet. So how do we get there? Well, it's going to require a whole suite of changes. How we do our food systems, how we design our buildings, sorts of business models, nature of jobs, tax systems, energy systems, transport systems, from the very local right up to the supranational. No one single shift will be sufficient. But like a jigsaw puzzle, if you put them together, they can start to add up to something significant, some different picture, a different story for the economy. And how I get my head around thinking about that plurality of shifts is by thinking about the four corners. Like if you're doing a jigsaw puzzle, you start with the corners. So what are the four corners of the wellbeing economy in practice? Rather neatly, they all start with P: purpose, prevention, pre-distribution, and people-powered. And purpose is essentially going back to basics and thinking, what is the economy for? Who is it for? Is it about a means to an end, or are we just constantly treating the economy as if it's an end in itself? This is about getting very fussy about what we're growing rather than focusing on the rate of growth, but talking about the composition and direction. What do we need more of in our economy because it's good for people and planet, and what, if we're really honest, do we need to power down because it's not aligned with the needs of people and planet. And of course, at the micro level, you can say the same thing to enterprises. What are the purpose-led businesses that we want to celebrate and inculcate? And we had a great conversation this morning where we asked the colleagues around the table to name some West Australian businesses that spoke to this agenda. And there were so many social enterprises and co-ops and businesses that are just about putting the circular economy at the heart of the conversation. I'll come back with some of my favourite examples in a moment. Prevention is about saying we have to do better than just spending downstream after the fact on failure demand and defensive expenditure. Even us as individuals have our version of that. The French economist Serge Latouche talks about the consolation goods industry. It's very real. That so much of what we spend on is consoling ourselves from our stressed and alienated lives. And so the prevention corner is about saying, channeling that inner 3-year-old, and maybe some of you have on your phone, where they go, your kids or your grandchildren or niece and nephew go through that stage of saying why, and looking upstream and daring to take action there. So, for example, the more our jobs pay people enough to live on, the less Jim Chalmers will be having to increase the budget, as he did last year, for rent assistance. The more those jobs give people a sense of dignity and purpose, the less our GPs will be writing prescriptions for anti-anxiety treatments. The more our production and consumption systems are circular rather than linear, the less we'll be having to spend Sunday morning doing beach cleanups. You get the point. It's about daring to take action at the root cause. Pre-distribution might just be my favourite corner of the jigsaw puzzle, because it's about saying, yes, of course there's a role for governments redistributing through taxes and transfers, but that's not enough. And it's a very fraught conversation in Australia for reasons that we could go into later. But pre-distribution is about saying, how could the market economy be designed in ways that deliver better outcomes from the first place? So worker-owned co-ops, community wealth building, true cost accounting, those sorts of things that get the market economy delivering the sort of outcomes we want to see. And then people-powered is about making sure that communities feel at the forefront of these changes, that they're in the driving seat of economic transition, that they're there having conversations around the boardroom, around the participatory budgeting discussions in citizens' assemblies. Rather than feeling done to, they feel they are part of the economy and making the key decisions. So what's the role of government in this? Now, government essentially sets the rules of the game. They can stop stuff happening, they can steer things in a different direction, and they can support the good stuff. So I want to give you a few of my favourite examples of governments who are rolling up their sleeves and showing what this looks like in practice. So the European Union had directed all its member states to take action to encourage a circular economy. And what Sweden did is said, all right, we're going to reduce our VAT, our GST equivalent, on repairing goods from 25% down to 12.5%. So when you're looking at a choice between throwing away something like this or repairing it, you're going to have a financial incentive to get it repaired rather than throw it away. France has just stopped short-haul flights. They said if you can get somewhere by train in 2.5 hours, go by train. You're not going to be able to fly. No, I know Australia's a bit rubbish with train system, so it doesn't really apply here, but you see they're starting to say this is counterproductive. So we're going to stop it. In terms of supporting things in Italy, they've had for decades something called the Macora Law, named after this chap, where they're supporting the worker-owned cooperative through ecosystem investment, support for transition and worker buyouts. And talking of stopping things, I love this from our colleagues in South Australia. They have recently banned those stupid bloody soy sauce plastic fishes. And I mean, it's a tiny example, isn't it? But it's a really beautiful example of, and I know this is very much against the zeitgeist and all discussion in Canberra at the moment about abundance and how bad regulation is, but just use regulation to stop bad stuff happening. Those little fishes are not necessary. Sushi, and I've spoken to colleagues and friends in South Australia, the sushi shops are finding ways around them. They're labelling you to use your soy sauce, or they've got little biodegradable packets. There's ways around this. Innovation happens within boundaries like this. People are still creative. So there are a couple of quite small examples that give you a sense of the sort of things that governments are doing around the world. But what about businesses? Because businesses are a critical part of this. But one of my least favourite phrases is the business community. as if it's this sort of homogeneous group of everyone's the same. There are awesome businesses in reality, and then there are businesses that we need to power down because they're not contributing to what people and planet need. This is one of the more awesome ones. None of these are perfect, but they're more on the awesome scale. This is Triodos Bank, which is a Dutch bank. My UK bank account is with these folks. They've been set up, there was a B Corp, and their mission is to channel financial credit into the sort of activities that we need more of in a wellbeing economy. So renewable energy, for example, public transport systems and so on. But they're also embracing the circular economy agenda. And as we were discussing this morning, this is their headquarters, and it's all put together with screws. So it can be 100% dismantled and every bit of building equipment reused in a different way. It's just making those choices to really take care of nature. Speaking of which, this is an Edinburgh-based company called Faith in Nature that makes a whole wide range of shower gels and shampoos and conditioners. They have appointed someone on their board whose job it is to speak up for nature around the boardroom table. This Banco Popular is the third biggest bank in Costa Rica, and it's owned by Costa Rican workers. It has a mission to take care of social justice and sustainability objectives in Costa Rica. Over 50% by mandate of its board are women, and it's recently released a new 5-year strategy. And in developing it, they spent 3 years across the country in consultation with Costa Ricans about how their bank could play a better role in taking care of social justice and sustainability outcomes. All decisions are taken very democratically, and it's a brilliant example of a big company but operating with a different logic at its heart. Is it too early to talk about beer? No, this is Western Australia. This is one of my favourite examples. This is a guy called Mark Hazel. He runs Draw Brew, which is just outside Glasgow. So next time you're in Glasgow, go and visit him. He wakes up every morning thinking, how can he make his business more sustainable? He is trying to capture the carbon that comes from the brewing process. Those plastic shells that go around beer cans when you get a 6-pack. He's making alternative to that comes from prawn shells, that's completely biodegradable. And the line of beer he has is made from bread that would have gone to landfill from a nearby bakery. And we asked him, do you want to get bigger? Mark, do you want to just grow and become a massive company? And he thought about it and he said, well, yeah, I'd like to get a bit bigger, because then I could do bottling on site, and that would cut down my supply chains and travel costs, and that would reduce the environmental footprint of our production. But I don't want to get too big, because if I did get too big, then I'd have to be in the office all day doing the accounts, and what I love is making beer, and it would take me away from the beer production process. So I love that, because it's about being fussy, as I said earlier, about growth for a purpose, not for its own sake. And I think this, for my colleagues at We All Scotland, gets the prize for the best title of a report. See what they did there, tapping into a wellbeing economy. But they researched across the craft beer brewing industry or sector in Scotland and found a completely different way of working amongst craft brewers. It's all about the locality, employing locally, embracing the local brand, taking care of the local region, making sure that your employers are looked after because they're your neighbours as well, so making sure their terms and conditions and their workplaces are safe, collaborating with each other horizontally, sharing recipes, sharing equipment, sharing sustainability practices, because they see themselves as in competition with not each other, but with the bigger mass production brewers. And they very much see their success is about the craft, not getting bigger. And what I love about that, and I know you've got some amazing craft brewers here in Western Australia, it's doing business, it's being commercially viable, but for a different purpose and a different logic at the heart of business. This is one of my almost final examples. This is a beautiful beauty product company, and they make their products using old ground coffee granules that would have been thrown away by local cafes, and it smells divine. This is a report that I think is quite amazing. It's called New Economy Report, and it was published about this time last year, and it talks about how we need to tackle the poly crisis with a big economic reset, and it warns of trying to retrofit sustainability onto an inherently unsustainable economic system. It talks about the principles of sufficiency, of circularity systems thinking, value, equity and justice. It's a beautiful report. What I think is significant about this report is who wrote it. Ernst & Young. And now I'm not stupid enough to think that every single employee at Ernst & Young agrees with this, but I think it's significant that a big consulting firm like Ernst & Young is starting to pay attention to this conversation and putting some of their best minds into a dedicated new economy movement, a unit in the organisation that's starting to say, what does a different economic system look like? They're starting to push the conversation and respond to some of their client demands. Not there yet, but this is how change happens, at that far end of the bell curve, at the margins, by those forerunners, showing what is possible. Let me just tell you briefly about some amazing places, geographies that are putting this into practice. I talked earlier about what's happening in Italy. Well, one of the outcomes of that is the Emilia-Romagna region up in northern Italy, where Bologna, famous for bolognese, is the capital city of that region. And 1/3 of the region's GDP comes from a worker-owned cooperative. And you see the results there. High wages, high female participation, strong political activism. This is another famous locality. This is the town of Preston in northern England, who for the last 50 years has been doing their economic development strategy through community wealth building. Basically saying we need to build the economy from the community up rather than waiting for wealth to trickle down, because that is not going to happen. So using levers like procurement, local ownership, local businesses, making sure financial flows circulate locally, kicking off that local economic multiplier for the economists in the room. They've been able to achieve a very different dynamic of their local economy. They've been named the most resilient city through the global financial crisis as it hit the UK. Wages have gone up, mental health problems have come down, and even subjective self-reported wellbeing and happiness has gone up. Scotland is getting on the bandwagon as well. They've had a minister for community wealth building, and there's a community wealth building bill winding its way through the Scottish Parliament as we speak. Finally, I was warned not to show you examples from the East Coast, but I've got one. This is Bega Valley. And I'm showing you because I love their mission. They want to become the heart of the circular economy. It's led by Bega Cheese, who you probably know, a farmers co-op. They're setting up a centre to encourage and celebrate circularity. And I think it's a brilliant mission to saying, what can we do really well here to inspire the rest of Australia? So sorry about the East Coast example. Where are we up to? So I've talked a little bit about 3-year-olds, channeling your inner 3-year-old to look upstream at the root causes, raising your gaze. When I was in Glasgow during COVID, and I'd ring my nephews in Canberra and they'd put me on this sort of WhatsApp call and they'd show me their bedrooms, it looked like this. Pieces of Lego scattered across the floor. And I think now the best case reading of where the economic change movement is up to is that we have Lego wins. For every example of policy I've shared with you, I could have shared with you 20 more. For every example of an amazing business enterprise, I could have shared with you 50 more. There are amazing practices happening in boardrooms, in communities, in places, and in the corridors of power here in Australia and around the world. There is no shortage of innovative forerunners that are showing what change looks like. But it's like Lego scattered across my nephew's floor. It's there, but it's disconnected. It's not yet adding up to something significant and systemic, and hence it's vulnerable to being trodden on and kicked out of the way and really annoying the person who treads on it. That would be good though. But the task is to go from having incredible examples and amazing prototypes to something that is about systemic change, that actually really reshapes the economic ecosystem writ large. And that's going to require a much more fundamental mindset about how we think about the economy. It means we need to think about the economy as no longer something that we serve and that we wedge all our objectives into. Things like saying, well, gender equality is good for economic growth, reducing poverty is good for economic growth, worker wellbeing is good for productivity, but actually saying, what sort of economy do we need to take care of people and planet? What sort of economy is good for us? And that task is much harder. because it is much easier to talk about small-scale downstream responses. This is a story, I follow this thing on Instagram called Global Positive News, just because I need the Batuta Advocate and I need some positive news every day, and because, you know, state of the world. And this is a lovely story that came across feeds around this great example of the chap with the beard saw this old fella working in Walmart well into his 80s. And the chap with the beard said, this is a travesty, why is this old fella still working in Walmart? He was a veteran and couldn't pay his housing costs. And so chap with the beard said, right, I'm going to set up a GoFundMe page, raise some money, help you be able to retire and live out your final years. Raise some money, brilliant, lovely story. But no one in that conversation was asking, how much does Walmart pay him? What are rents and housing prices like? What are his medical bills like? Who's paying for them? And so I think the shift in conversation, our task as people who are interested in economic system change, is to embrace this challenge and audacious, going beyond those heartwarming stories that are just small-scale downstream responses to an inhumane system, but actually dare to ask, how can we tell the story about system change if we raise our gaze and look upstream, and why people like that fellow working at Walmart were so vulnerable? Have those conversations to change our mindset so we can start to add up all those Lego wins and transform our economic system. And it's about changing that dominant conversation that is so profoundly disconnected from conversations that communities across Australia are having. It's disconnected from what those amazing businesses are doing, and it's disconnected from what people on planet really need. Thank you so much.
Okay, so thanks, Catherine, for that kind of multi-dimensional, multifaceted look from the macro to the micro, from the personal to the corporate, you know, to kind of give us an insight of kind of how the political economy is structured, and, you know, the good and the bad and the ugly and everything in between, all of those. So we're going to open it up to questions. So myself and Claire are going to run the microphones. We would like you just to ask a question so that Catherine can respond. I say this all the time at these events, but, you know, if you've got a question, make it, or if you raise your hand, make sure it's a question. Say who you are, where you're from, and then direct it to Catherine so we can get a response, and we can get around the room as well. So, okay, I see one hand up there straight away, and Claire on your side, green, so we'll do one. I'll go first and then you, okay? And I'll get my steps up tonight.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I'm Ming Hui and I'm from Perth. I was wondering, if the current economy is measured by GDP or GDP per capita, what would your ideal economy be measured by?
That's a question.
That's awesome, because it gives me an excuse to talk about one of my favourite topics of conversation, cornerstone indicators. There are plenty of alternative measures of progress out there. So whether it's the OECD's Better Life Index, or the UN's Human Development Report, or the World Economic Forum's Sustainable Growth Index, a whole wide range of measures of progress and different indices that are out there. None of them, none of them are yet cutting through to the extent that they're dislodging GDP in the minds of politicians and in the dominant economic discourse. And I think partly that's because there's a disconnect between these really well-intentioned measures of progress that very quickly, when they're created, become relatively technical abstractions, essentially. And you know, most normal people, when they're talking about dashboards and indicators, they're talking about their cars, not their quality of life. And so we're not having a community movement, force, agitation, energy around these measures. And so I've been working, just started chipping away at an idea for a while that the organisation Dark Matter Labs have taken up and run with. I don't know if folks know Dark Matter Labs, but it's what we call cornerstone indicators. And it's essentially saying, could we have some measures that have to speak to key domains and dimensions of well-being? That's one task. But the same measures also have to make intuitive sense to the community in question. So this exercise has been done in a municipality in Sweden, in the massive Cairngorms National Park in Scotland. Colleagues from Regen Sydney have been working with Waverley Council around the city of Bondi to develop some cornerstone indicators. And the sort of things they're coming up with when they have these conversations are really beautiful, sort of like sexy proxies, if you like. So one for decent work was on Sunday night, not dreading the work week ahead. Another one was having busy pavements but quiet streets. In Bondi, they wanted to cut down on consumption, and so they said, what if we just had tiny bins instead of those massive bins that each house had? Mel and Gemma, we did a session at the ARPA conference last year, and one of the ones, and help me if I get this a bit wrong, Gemma, it was, so this is a public health community, was walking down the street and seeing people's teeth because they smile at you and they're not looking at their phones. At a food conference, one of the other ones was knowing your baker and speaking to your baker once a week. And I was hearing that in was it Vincent, the most livable city in West Australia? So David, our colleague from there who came along this morning, he was saying that one of the important changes that they're seeing in the city of Vincent is more local bakeries. So that number would be going up in the city of Vincent. And the one I use most regularly to describe it is the number of girls who ride their bikes to school. So imagine if that number is going up. There's a measure of financial sufficiency that parents can afford bicycles. They can afford breakfasts, which is not always the case as we speak. That the streets are safe enough. There's local service provision of schools and so on. Anyway, that's a long answer, but I reckon, wouldn't it be amazing if, say, the next mayor of Perth goes on the campaign trail saying, I want to increase on my watch the number of girls who ride their bikes to school rather than things like the number of police on the beat. It'd be a very different conversation. Do you want to join? You should introduce yourself. I will give shorter answers, I promise, because we want to hear from Jamie.
Hello, thanks Catherine. My name's Phoebe Coyne, and I wanted to try and not get emotional because I see the glass half empty all the time, and WA has this enormous surplus and our health system is in crisis, and as somebody fantastically just said the other day, we don't have a universal health system. We have a public health system that has been defunded for decades. I'm going to give a little précis. I came back from doing a master's in unorthodox economics from the UK 15 years ago to the East Coast, and I went, there's no new economics narrative in Australia. So I was unemployed for my first year on return and tried to start up what is now the New Economy Network Australia. And I haven't recovered returning to Perth some years ago, just in terms of what's not happening, but I'm not well connected with the people I need to be connected here with. I teach complex systems at Murdoch. I watched Purpose, and I've followed Lorenzo for some time. Catherine's film with Lorenzo Fioramonti is called Purpose, and was showed a while ago by Mary Fatt and our climate leaders at Netherlands, at Windsor. I resent, I balk at the use my language, soy fish banning. It's rearranging deck chairs, and I just there are so many barriers. Yeah, there are so many barriers working against us to create real progress. And as you say, there's so much happening, but it's not coordinated to groundswells, and the groundswells are what change systems. What keeps you going?
Consolation goods? No. It's a real privilege to do this work. I mean, I think to do work that's aligned with your values and gives you a sense of purpose is the other 1%. I mean, I think most people are doing work that's not aligned with their values, where they're just eking out the bare minimum. And so I'm very, very conscious of what a privilege it is, but also what keeps me going is the community that's building around this, a community of practice, the crazy, wide, diverse, pluralistic movement that I describe as the economic change movement. And when it's at its best, it has your back, it shares inspiration, you can have a lot of fun and laugh a lot with that movement. They share the ups and downs, and it's really important to spend time in that community. And you've got Matt here, so who else is here from everyone from the Wellbeing Economy Alliance here. Georgie, where's up? Oh, sitting with Saul, sorry. So speak to these colleagues of yours here, because I often describe, Georgie, you've heard me say this a lot, around the Wellbeing Economy movement as a bit like a comfy sofa. You know, you're walking up a hill and you're tired, and you get to this beautiful cabin and you sit down in this comfy old sofa and recharge. That's what the Wellbeing Economy Alliance is about. It's about taking care of practitioners who, when they go back to their institutions or their organisations, are often the outliers. They're often told they're heretical and naive for trying to ask those bigger questions about the economy. And I think what we need to do is expand the we of that movement, help support all these incredible businesses that do exist in Australia, that are the exception that proves the rule, but help celebrate them as being part of the beginnings of something different. That's the task, because they're currently going against the headwinds, and so need to change those policy instruments so they're much more supportive, like they did in Italy. Change some laws and investment flows to back in worker cooperatives, for example, so that we can have more of those sorts of businesses. So they're no longer exceptional and going against the grain, but they're the new normal. How do you keep going? Because Joni, who's amazing here, has done incredible work.
I think if we didn't keep going, we'd just lay down and die, I think we've got to get up each day and, against all odds, keep going. What else are we going to do? I think you outlined really well this kind of ecosystem of prototypes, these Lego pieces of groups doing these really amazing things. And I think in WA we've got an ecosystem of amazing social enterprises, regenerative initiatives, really great upstream social change initiatives coming out of our sector. And I think what we're really at now is a kind of point where it's the opportunity for those to start to see scale. They can't just keep operating under their own steam. You're swimming against a flow, and it's really exhausting. So I think what is needed to achieve scale is to see some of those shifts in the policy environment, the funding environment, the kind of support mechanisms of the economy, because it's really naive to think we could just do good, and there'll be no headwinds. I think this system, as it currently is, favours the incumbent, and so I think, and some of those are, just you talk about some of the barriers to some of these changes. Some of them are just, apathy of people who've got it good right now. But there are some very real elements who are actively opposing the kind of shift to a wellbeing economy, because the current system serves them very, very well. Yep. Yes. So I think those little Lego pieces, they're coming together. You've talked about some of the networks. I think finding the others. But I think there's a real relationship between the community and government, which can be much more than the kind of adversarial relationship we sometimes have. And this morning, in the round table, we had some senior government people who were there, and they were really on board. They were really keen, but they, said we really lack the kind of social license from the community for some of these things. And we were asking, what can we do to help you do the good things you want to do, the policy changes. One of them said, gather together, build a groundswell, and relentlessly go to your ministers, because as they hear those things, they'll come to us and ask us to make some of those changes. So I think getting a sense that this is a thing that the public wants, the community wants, builds a groundswell for the kind of bigger picture shifts that we need for those little Lego pieces to become more than that.
Sorry, one more.
I've got a question over here.
Can I just do
somebody waiting patiently?
Okay, sorry. This is hopefully really relevant because it's something that's, I'm not normally very hopeful about the future, in all honesty, but something that has given me cause for hope recently was some research that's just come out of the London School of Economics, where the scholars spoke to over 400 people in various businesses, like big corporates in the UK, and well over 90% of the people they interviewed said they were really supportive of and up for wellbeing economy, donut economic practices. But here's the kicker, they thought only half of their colleagues were. And I think there's something profoundly hopeful there, because to close that gap is doable. That's an education, awareness raising campaign. And so we're in one of those first mover, second get up to dance moments, but that's changeable. Right, Chris, sorry.
Oh, good. Thanks, Catherine. Chris Toomey from Waikos. You mentioned in passing the abundance agenda in Canberra, and I could sense from that you really wanted to critique it for us and tell us why it's so stupid, so go for it.
Yeah, I'm just very, very sceptical about seeing a political community, political leadership fall over themselves for a book that's written for America, for an American audience, that paints a quite dystopian vision of the future in its opening pages. Look, I know regulations build up like barnacles on a boat, and they need to be fit for purpose and consolidated and clarified and timely. But I think the sort of unilateral anti-regulation, because one person's regulations are another person's hard fought for rights and standards. And so I'm very sceptical of this sort of tarring all regulations with the same brush. And we heard around that productivity reform roundtable back in August, when Danielle Woods did a speech to the press club at the beginning of that week, saying every public servant needs to wake up and thinking, what have they done for growth today? And warning against what she called regulatory hairballs, things like support for local jobs, support for local businesses, heritage legislation, and energy efficiency standards. Now, if you ask me, all those things are really good. They're not regulatory hairballs. They are higher standards. So I'm very nervous about the sort of fetishization of a book that a sort of sweeping interpretation of how it's being talked about. I think that to give credit to the authors, Thompson and Klein, it's more sophisticated than that, but how it's being interpreted is, yeah, so I'm worried. I don't know if other folks have...
Another question here, and then we'll cross over to the other side.
Thank you. This is a great follow-on to your answer actually just then, because well-being is seen often as part of the degrowth movement. It's only a subset of that, and at its heart, the degrowth movement is an anti-capitalist movement. It's looking at how non-essential production should go. You don't just produce things in order to make a profit. So looking across the water to New Zealand, New Zealand Greens, the Aotearoa New Zealand Greens Party, brought in a wellbeing economy a few years back. I understand that it's struggling a lot at the moment, that it's slowly being dismantled by the changes in government. So when it comes to implementing these things, we need to have a much more fundamental shift than just a governmental sort of decide they're going to try this time. So what are the actual fundamentals to the change in our economies that is needed, rather than just small businesses doing things differently? There has to be a bigger change, surely, to make this work.
So, I mean, it's essentially having a different logic at the heart of economic system that's about well-being. As I say, it's about having the economy there to serve us rather than the other way around. It's really rethinking the role and purpose of the economy, thinking about growth not as the rate of growth, but the composition and direction of growth. And I don't use the term degrowth for a whole wide range of reasons. I talk about being fussy about growth. being very fussy, to be unilaterally pro-growth, as if all growth is the same, I think is terribly unsophisticated, but so is to be unilaterally anti-growth, because it depends what we need more of. And so that's why I say we've got to be fussy, let's be really selective about what we want to grow. And in all honesty, that's what most degrowthers talk about. They're saying these are the things we want more of, and here's what we need to power down. New Zealand's an interesting story. It's actually under the National Party, the ruling National Party, before Jacinda Ardern came in 2017. That's when they were in charge. The Treasury of New Zealand created the Living Standards Framework. The Living Standard Frameworks then, when Jacinda and her Finance Minister Grant Robertson got elected in October 2017, and they said, we want to do a wellbeing budget, said to Treasury, what have we got? They said, well, look, we've got this brilliant Living Standards Framework. Right, let's use this to shape the wellbeing budget. It was relatively top-down exercise. And it was what they invested in, I'd say, wasn't really economic system change. It was more funding for, say, mental health services, more funding for income support, which I think is not tackling the economy, it's dealing with some of the downstream damage of the current economic system. What they did do really well was compel much more cross-departmental work. And they said to government departments, if you want some of this pot of money, you have to come to us with multi-departmental bids. And in the first few years, like you'd get the housing department coming up saying, here's our bid. And they'd say, well, who have you got in partnership? No one. On you go. Do it again. Come back with partners. And so they got better over time. They changed legislation. They changed the Finance Act to mandate more regular reporting on the wellbeing statistics. And also they changed the Public Sector Act to enable that cross-departmental work, that diagonal budgeting. So they brought in, well, actually it had been in there a while, something called CBA+, so much bigger, much more complicated, sophisticated cost-benefit analysis. As you all know, the government changed last year. It's now a right-of-centre party. From what I hear from colleagues in Weo Aotearoa is that they're basically doing word search changes and removing the word wellbeing, but framing it as sort of social investment. They're doing a lot of other stuff that's quite counterproductive to this agenda too. That feels like a different conversation. But there's some really amazing work still happening under the radar in New Zealand, particularly support for Maori-led businesses through procurement supply chains. There's some incredible organisations these are businesses that have a different purpose at their heart. It's to take care of their community and family members and so on. Yeah, it's to be financially viable, but that's the means rather than the ends. And that's the logic that's at the heart of the wellbeing economy on a macro level too. Do you want to add anything around?
I was just reflecting on WA's engagement in some of these things, and our own government's done some really great work over the last few years around the Aboriginal procurement policy, and it's rolled out a whole kind of incremental percentage each year at which all government procurements need to recruit from Aboriginal businesses, so procure from Aboriginal businesses, and then for a certain percentage of those there's employment targets as well. There's certainly opportunity to broaden that to cover other kinds of procurement. So there's opportunities around disability or jobs-focused enterprises, and a whole range of other kind of opportunities ahead of our government to kind of level up with other states. But they've really done some really great work in that one, and it's something we can be proud of.
Question over that side.
Hi. I'm not really sure how to word this, but I have been in the social enterprise space as a small business doing mental health stuff for the past couple of years, which is ridiculous because there's people who are facing mental health challenges, don't have money and can't afford things, and getting funding is like near impossible. So I guess but I've seen a lot of small businesses and social enterprises have a really big sustainability focus. And I see that there's lots of funding for that as well. So I'm just curious as to, I think if we are to take better care of the environment from a community level, we can't do that if we can't work together. And, if you've got mental health issues, and I think there's great benefit for mental well-being engaging in that kind of stuff as well. So I'm just curious as to how you think this is where I don't know how to frame my question, like how we might shift towards investing in people's mental health in the community for the planet as well as our own wellbeing economy. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I'm pondering that, Cheryl. Do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it comes down to looking at why people are suffering mental health problems, and some of it will be because of hormones and chemicals, but a lot of, I think, distress that communities and people are feeling is a very rational reaction to the state of the world. And I was reflecting the other day at the sort of levels of distress and frustration and sense of overwhelm and alienation out in the world. And actually, again, I'm going to choose to see that as a sense of a cause for hope, because it means people are not okay with this current system. People know that all is not well. And I think we were talking about this at lunch, that you see manifestations of that stress response in the flight, fight, freeze and fawn reaction that trauma specialists would talk about. And I think we see people reacting in those different ways, in different manifestations of that. And I think the task for the economic change movement in its broader sense is to find ways to meet people where they are with compassion and work with them to come up with a different response to this crazy, inhumane economic system that is not fight, flight, freeze or fawn. I don't have the answer to that, but that to me feels a change. And I find a lot of hope in compassion as a potential methodology for system change, rather than just a lovely, nice state of affairs, but compassion that really understands why people are stressed and anxious and frustrated and the sort of bounded agency they feel. And then, so there's 4 stages of compassion. One's noticing suffering, next one's feeling empathy for the suffering, next one's understanding the suffering. So doing that analysis, that upstream analysis, and then the 4th is taking action. And that, I think, as a methodology, seems that I feel that's been a missing piece of our toolkit thus far, but I think it offers a lot of hope.
Got a question at the back. I'm just conscious of time, so got a question at the back, and we've got one down here as well. So Claire, if you want to.
Hello, ma'am. I'm Shubham. I've recently moved here from India. Ma'am, you mentioned about prevention and pre-distribution. In the current scenario, we see that the people in charge of decision making are governed by a few companies who are aiming for shareholder satisfaction over stakeholder satisfaction. Now, in a case like this, how do you reckon we can instill a well-being economy, and how do we bring about that change, ma'am?
No, I feel like this is absolutely your bag.
So I think, one, there are some amazing people working within big companies doing really, really good stuff. And it's often the way those companies are governed and incentivized that can compel them into taking steps that are incredibly harmful for communities, people, workers and planet. And to give you one example, there's been all this talk in Australia over the last few years of the cost of living crisis and price gouging by our duopoly of supermarkets, and the pressure they've been exerting on suppliers and workers in order to increase their margins. What I haven't heard in that analysis is a conversation around the sorts of business models that drive companies to push those margins to the nth degree, to extract finance to go up to shareholders, rather than seeing their business model as one to serve workers, to serve communities, to serve customers. And so I think is there's a real missing conversation around what sort of business models. And I shared a quote this morning from the OECD where they say very explicitly, we need to look at the nature of business models that make up the economy. And I don't hear that conversation loud enough in Australia at all. Because not all businesses are the same. There's models that are set up to really take care and enable commercial viability to be a means rather than the end. And the other piece, I think, that's probably in the undercurrent of your question is levels of corporate power. And I think and their corporate influence over policy making, and no starker example than in gambling in Australia. I mean, that's got all the hallmarks of potential successful public policy change, huge levels of public support, cross-party support for change, big figures, the late Peter Murphy, even, big figures on both sides of politics calling for this, Tim Costello and so on, analysis of what needs to be done. So Peter Murphy's committee did all the analysis, here's what's need to be done in, gambling and advertising. So tick, 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 and yet, there is not enough action, and it speaks to the extent of political capture from some of those big firms. And so that's huge and enormous and can feel hopeless, but I think the only potential I can see, and if others have got better examples and better solutions, please tell me, but is to build a countervailing force that gives politicians the sense that they can stare down those vested interests. And I think that only will come through translating those beautiful supportive public opinion polls that we see into more proactive mobilisation that politicians feel the heat of. And they feel the heat of that to the extent they know it's safe ground for them to step into, because it's very rare to have a politician who'll be brave. There are some, they're amazing, but they're not enough.
Okay, we've got a question here in the front.
Hi, Catherine. My name is Ross. My history actually is in the corporate sector, so it's been fascinating. I just wanted to ask you, and just carrying on from the comments you've both just made, when you talk about the wellness economy, to me also is sorry? Wellbeing, sorry. I'm also a grandfather, and I'm very conscious of the fact that if you talk about these issues, there's probably, in my view, almost nothing more important to governments to empower people to choose what we feed our families. And everyone would know that in Australia we have a government system of a 5-star rating that goes on to food products. But a lot of people don't realise, of course, thanks to the food lobbying, that's voluntary. So that's why you only see 5- and 4-star ratings on the food, because if you make crap, 1, 2 and 3, you just don't put it on. So taking what you've talked about today, and this gets to my question, could you imagine a government that was brave enough to take that 5-star system and firstly say every item will get a 5-star, but we're going to go beyond just the quality of food, but we're now going to introduce the things to which you've referred to today. Are they packaged in plastic? I mean, this would create a big bureaucracy to do that, but I just want to know whether something like that, because if governments wanted to do it, they could. And as I say, from the corporate sector, I'll tell you why. Because I think the majority of the community, if we had a 5-star rating system that was to embrace what you've talked about, I think that would have enormous widespread community support. Sadly, why it won't happen, of course, is the big food lobbies. As I said, we can't even get a compulsory 5-star system. As I said, the one at the moment is ridiculous, so we should just get rid of it. So I just wanted to know what your thoughts about not only improving that, but to take it to the next step where it embraces some of the things to which you referred to this evening.
It feels more like a comment than a question, but it's a really good idea, though.
So I think governments helping highlight good practice is really important. So in Brazil, 2 years ago, they released something called the Dirty List, and they basically name and shame companies that use forced labour in their supply chains. And they say, we will not procure from you, you will not get government contracts, and everyone in the Brazilian public, look at these guys, you can choose to avoid them. In terms of food and health policies, you've got a couple of experts here, Mel Edmonds and Gemma Crawford, and their colleague, hello, who from the public health community, who you can perhaps speak to them at the end. But I think Yeah, helping spotlight good practice and reward it is a great example. And Joni talked about procurement. Australia actually has a really good story to tell on using the lever of procurement. Federal government is upping the ante on sustainability in contracts that it receives. In the ACT, where I'm based, they have this awesome thing called Gender on the Tender, where... We're poets in Canberra. Where they're basically, to get construction contracts in the public sector, you have to have, or plans to develop, gender equality across all levels of the construction company. In Scotland, they also have something called the Sustainable Procurement Duty, where to get government contracts, you can't be using tax havens, you have to pay living wages, you have to have certain measures of gender equality, plans to meet Paris climate targets and all sorts of things. So really rewarding companies that are stepping in the right direction, I think, is a really important mechanism of change, whether that's 5-star movements or some other way of highlighting and celebrating those companies. I don't know. There'll be different arguments on how to do it, but I think at the guts of your question is saying, yeah, these are the sort of business behaviours that are aligned with what people and planet need, so let's bring them to the fore and spotlight them and celebrate them.
Okay, I think we've got a question at the back there. Very quickly, or repeat questioner.
If I can still a repeat question. Just to play devil's advocate, you've criticised the current economy or explain how it could be better. Do you think there are some elements that work, and if so, could you name 2 or 3?
And if we can make it quick, because we've got one more question here, that would be great, because we're going to have to wrap up soon.
You're going to do wrap up? Paul's wrapping up. Just this morning there was a couple of things we talked about, just a couple of things that WA does really well that we've kind of got over the eastern states, and some things about our economy that are really good. One of them was the fact that Western Australia is the only state which owns its own lottery system. So Lottery West is a uniquely WA-owned entity, and all the proceeds of that are distributed directly back to the public through grants. So that's not the case in other countries, and as part of that, that means we don't have pokies in Western Australia, which I think is a real boon for our own economy. The other thing we have in WA is that we've organised the ways that our roads are kind of funded and managed in a way that we don't have tolls. So again, I think that's something that we have in WA that's really an advantage over some other parts of the country. Have you got other kind of ones that spring to your mind?
Yeah, you're meaning more systemically as opposed to those Lego pieces. I mean, I think if you compare Australia to so many other countries around the world, we're, on average terms, we're doing okay. I mean, high levels, I think life expectancy is a really good measure of that, and we have relatively high life expectancies, but of course there's huge inequalities of that, and particularly amongst First Nations communities who die, 8 years below, younger than the rest of us, for all sorts of reasons. People would argue that Australia's social mobility, apart from the very bottom and the very top, is relatively good. Now, I think social mobility is a problematic agenda for all sorts of reasons, but you could argue that that's an example. One of the things I've been most heartened with since coming back to Australia a few years ago is just how many enterprises, big and small, are getting on with making positive change. They're not using the framing of wellbeing economy, but particularly in the circular economy space, they're just really starting to treat waste as a resource and have a different approach to design of products and their production and consumption systems. And as we said earlier, I do think Australia has a great story to tell on procurement, on using the lever of procurement. I think procurement officers can be the heroes of a wellbeing economy, because they can start to shape where public spending goes, and there are a lot at state and federal level, really, really good examples of using that. But Australia has it's got a track record of making big changes in the past, making big economic shifts, and we're seeing the consequences of them today, and not least in the housing crisis. Policy matters in Australia. Policy can be changed. It's not like gravity, and so we do have a history of being able to change it. If you've got examples, let's come tell me afterwards.
Okay, last question.
I'll try to make the question quick, but the answer may be long. So one thing that we keep thinking about, and maybe this question is more about a systems piece rather than a Lego piece. When you talk about well-being economy, how do we think about it while still acknowledging the effects of colonialism, the effects of intergenerational trauma? There are a lot of systems of embedded disadvantage in the picture that can't necessarily be solved by early intervention or prevention. There has to be clear work to tackle that. Where does that sit in within the well-being framework?
Racial justice and decolonisation is a critical part of the wellbeing economy. I talk in that paper about the need for reparations and land back and in a way that's part of predistribution. If you keep asking why and you go beyond the economy, keep asking why upstream, you find yourself facing colonisation. And I don't know if you're here, but when I started my remarks by saying we need to recognise the extent to which our apparent wealth, our GDP, is on the back of stolen land and unpaid rent. So that is a huge undercurrent to this conversation. But those real needs that I put up, dignity, purpose, fairness, they won't be achieved with the extent of racial discrimination, gender injustices, history of colonialism that we've still got and the damage that's still doing today. So I think it's a critical part of this conversation.
Okay, I'm going to call time because we're at time. So let me just shuffle over to here. So for those of you who are interested in the Good Together movement, if you've got your phones handy on you, you can scan the QR code. And it might come to your conversation earlier in the responses here about, building up from the ground up and getting involved in those conversations and in that kind of that ecosystem, a very localized ecosystem, but from little things, big things grow, I think is the turn of phrase, okay? So we can kind of think about that as well. And just before I kind of thank Catherine, just to give a bit of a heads up for some things that are coming our direction. So in November, we're holding a policy summit on the higher education sector. For anybody here who's interested in the higher education sector, and you want to come along to that, scan the code, I'll take you to the registration page. And then just keeping on the economics trip for a second, we're very excited to have Victoria Bateman, who's going to be joining us from London on an online lecture on the 4th of December about her new book, Economic Global History of Women, Wealth and Power. So if you know Victoria, she's quite a renowned British scholar who's done 2 other books on kind of the sex factor and naked feminism as well. She's got and quite renowned for her approach to promoting her book, Naked Feminism, because she did a lot of her lectures naked, basically. So look her up online. More details are coming soon, but you're first to get the scoop on this, and we were just chatting to Victoria a couple of weeks ago about her new book, and it's a really kind of exciting, from antiquity all the way through to kind of see the role that women have played and things. So, and on that, I think it's, I'd like to kind of thank Catherine for coming over to Western Australia, Matt for starting the conversation early on, and the rest of his team in making this all happen. A lot of ideas, a lot of thoughts, a lot of discussion points to kind of go away with. So a big round of applause for Catherine for that. If you have time, I think Catherine's happy to kind of hang around for a little bit. So if you want to have a chat with her and stuff, we can do that. Okay, so thank you as well for coming out on a Monday night as well. So, and see you home. Thanks, everybody.